I use this image almost all the time when I'm talking to different groups about coverage of religion, because everybody comes to it, everybody's idea of it is very different. And this is kind of a modernized version of this parable of, blind people touching an elephant and being told to describe what the elephant is like. And I think that's very true of the coverage of religion. It's very different depending on if you're writing from a mainstream media outlet, if you're writing or covering religion at a broadcast outlet, at a religious magazine, as a blogger. It's very different. And that as a result, it makes it very hard for us to have a lot of academic knowledge about religion and journalism and religion and communication. But I am going to just spend like literally 3 minutes with a little bit of historical background, because first of all, I'm a professor and that's what I do. But secondly, it's really important. We tend to look at when we talk about coverage of religion in the media and religious communication, we look at it with blinders on and think that the 1960s was ancient times. And so there's this long history and tradition, and you're all part of a long, long legacy of religion trying to communicate about faith and values in the public. So the very first U.S. newspaper, in fact, which was in Boston in 1690, it was very short-lived, but among the very first sentences in that publication was that they would first and foremost cover the memorable occurrences of divine providence, that they may not be neglected or forgotten. And so right from the beginning in our country, religion was a key topic. And in fact, many of the newspaper publishers at the time made most of their money by printing religious notices and religious tracts and pamphlets and things, particularly in the 1700s. There was a strong economic relationship between religion and its publication. Similarly, in terms of religious content, religious magazines, the first U.S. religious magazine was reportedly founded in Boston in 1743. It coincided with the First Great Awakening, and it went on for about 2 years. And that's actually its title, so, it would not work on Twitter, no way. But at any rate, these religious newspapers, and then religious newspapers started emerging after religious magazines, particularly in the second religious revivals. A second religious revival in the United States between around 1790 and 1820 or so. And according to one historian, in 1850, there were some 52 religious periodicals in New York City alone. So that tells you that there was this huge flourishing of religious publication. And of course, similarly, a lot of these publications, particularly Catholic ones, started because you had immigrants coming to this country and they were speaking languages. They were speaking German and French and languages that were not common in most of the mainstream media at the time. And so religious media often was published in another language as well. So in the 1840s or so, it's kind of this period we call yellow journalism. James Gordon Bennett is credited with kind of beginning the coverage of religion as a kind of as a business, and covering it in the mainstream media in a straight way. And as some of these controversies and religious splits, there was just a lot of this going on in the 1800s in terms of religious bodies being created and new religious organizations emerging from others, and splits over the Civil War and slavery and so on and so forth. And there was a lot of change. And some religious news audiences started questioning whether religion and journalism or religion and communication could mix. And so I like to point that out, that, you know, we get criticized a lot, right? There's a lot of criticism in the public about how religion is covered from a lot of different sides. And this isn't new, I guess, is part of the point. It's to remember that this has been uncomfortable for audiences for a really long time. And I mentioned that one such comments, and going back to 1869. So they're old comments. So, type a quote here. So I'm really going to fast forward at this point, but just kind of following that line to talk about this trajectory of this profession, both from the religious communicators side of it, and also from journalists writing about faith and values in the mainstream media outlets. So the first professional association for religious media was in 1890, the Catholic Press Association. And you saw the Associated Church Press and Religious Communicators Council emerging in the next 20 or 30 years following that. Then right around toward the tail end of World War II and on into the almost to the 1950s, we saw another wave of these groups: the American Jewish Press Association, the National Religious Broadcasters Association, Evangelical Press Association, and then in 1949, Religion Newswriters was founded. It was originally founded as the Religious Newswriters Association, and it did include, in fact, people who worked for religious media outlets. And that name was changed, and its mission and focus honed a bit later on in the subsequent next two decades. So, and I also mention on here that there isn't really a Muslim per se, Muslim Journalists Association or Muslim Media Association. There is the National Arab American Newspaper Association, but of course that's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean they're Muslim. There is a South Asian Journalists Association, which includes a lot of journalists from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and so that organization was founded in about 1994, I believe. And then there is more recently an Arab and Middle Eastern Journalists Association, which is really an international organization. And these groups have come about in the last 15 or 20 years. So they're among the more recent organizations. And the pattern of when these organizations started, actually a lot of these organizations started before there were professional journalism organizations. The first U.S. School of Journalism is here at the University of Missouri, and it was founded in 1908. And you had a professional journalism educators organization was founded around 1920, I think. I can't remember how old SPJ is, but these journalism organizations and that professionalization of what we did was sometimes came much later than when the religious press and religious media group and communicators had founded and had professionalized. So again, it's just, I think, always good to remember that there is this long history and long tangent of what we do. So I'm jumping kind of quickly. I'm trying to hit some of the key topics that come up on this beat, whether you're writing about it from a faith perspective or writing about it from a perspective of, the general circulation media. And one of the questions, in fact, Lauren Marco yesterday at RNS had a story about the number of Muslims in the media, in the U.S. media. And we do know that there has been that we're a little bit out of sync in terms of the demographics of most journalists versus the demographics of the U.S. population as a whole. Now, one of the things that we will say at Religion Newswriters Association is, your faith and your background shouldn't matter in terms of your ability to cover any and all faith traditions fairly. But nonetheless, this comes up frequently as criticism. It comes up frequently in public discourse about how the media cover religion, how religious communicators and the mainstream media work together, and all sorts of those kinds of questions. So let me just interpret this a little bit. And this was published in 2007 from data from 2002. So it is old, but it is a survey that gets done regularly. And these are U.S. journalists in the mainstream media. So this kind of a survey doesn't really work in terms of religious communicators, because the vast majority of religious communicators are writing or communicating about a faith tradition with which they agree or believe or have a perspective on. So this does specifically have to do with mainstream general circulation media. And the trend that these scholars are seeing, and they have done this survey now multiple times, so we do have longitudinal data. What they're seeing, and it's really the larger box up at the top that's the most pertinent for current data. So in terms of asking what journalists practice now, in terms of, so this is currently, what did they practice? This is from 2002. They found that about 1/3 did not practice any religion, 34%. 27% were Protestants. 5% were evangelical Christians. 20% were Catholic. 4% Jewish, and 10% some other faith traditions. And this is a fairly small survey, so that's why they've grouped all those people together into that one lump, because this is a your typical randomized survey, but it's of 1,000 people. So those other religions are very small in number, and so that's why they group them together as other. And as they point out here, this is from a book that I use quite frequently, as you can see from my pencil markings. But if those who said other or none are combined, it's nearly half of the U.S. journalists fall into that category. And that is kind of out of sync, we might say, with, they're citing some census data, but we know from the Pew data too, of course, of the nuns and that growing number, that's still much higher than the general population. And so that's I think that's interesting, and I think it's important to remember that, because our editors, our managers, our media owners are included in that percent. And I think sometimes it has led to a devaluing of the topic of religion in newsrooms. The numbers down below talk about religious backgrounds. So it's comparing religious backgrounds with the U.S. adult population in general. And that's where I've circled 2002 data in both cases. But those are the backgrounds. The data at the top was current as of when the study was conducted. And I'm happy to talk more about this kind of data. There isn't a lot of this kind of data that's high quality. And so that's why I like to use this. It's very respected scholars who produce this. I will also add that just as on the religious communicators side, you would anticipate that you would find 100% of the individuals who practice a faith tradition, most likely for the organization they communicate on behalf of. Our own surveys, and that data is fairly old at this point, but when we have asked our own members of their religious background, about 75% say that they have a faith tradition, or that a faith tradition is very important, important or very important in their lives. So what we do know, rather loosely and with some, fairly old data, is that among our own membership at Religion Newswriters, that higher percentage of those journalists tend to be have a faith tradition or have a belief system that they adhere to at a much higher percentage than general journalists as a whole. And if you're in a newsroom, you probably know that. So I'm going to move on from these numbers, but I'm happy to talk more about this later on. But this gets brought up quite a bit in criticism of how the media cover religion. So I'm going to talk a little bit very quickly. I know I'm really running through these topics very quickly, but I'm going to talk a little bit about audiences versus dollars. And what we do know, those of you in newsrooms know that you get a lot of mail, you get tons of comments to stories. We know from various experiments that have occurred online that online content for religion becomes very popular and draws in huge audiences at times. As an example, for instance, Bob Mong, who is left in recent years as a longtime editor at the Dallas Morning News, worked at the Morning News when they had what was probably the country's most glorious religion section. And religion sections are actually almost extinct now. But at one time in the 90s, they were these huge, beautiful things. And newspapers were pouring a lot of money into them. There were opportunities for more diverse kinds of coverage, for much more soft news, and not such a honing on conflict narratives as we see today. But Bob always said that they had 50% of their readers read that religion section, but they couldn't get people to advertise in it. They couldn't even get religious families that owned large businesses to advertise in that section. And so a lot of times when there's criticism about how media outlets, and here I am talking about general media outlets primarily, cover and whether or not they cover religion and whether they're cutting back. There'll be a lot of focus on, are they cutting back? Are they expanding? A lot of times it's interpreted as being, whether it's secularist impulses or other sorts of things or an anti-religious bias, most of the time it's actually down to dollars. And nobody, and I will say nobody, has figured out how to get audiences to pay for religion news. Nobody has figured it out. BeliefNet made a really valiant effort for 10 years, and Pathos has been making that effort for a number of years, but nobody has really been successful. That's the sad news. On the other hand, nobody has figured out how to make online advertising or audiences pay for any other kind of news either. So I hesitate to, in this case, pull religion out and treat religion separately from other kinds of news, like science news or education news. I think business news is unique because there is a passion around paying for business news. But I think it's important when we talk about religion and media and religion and journalism to think about how that the beat itself is being affected by the industry trends as a whole. And it's not separate, it's the same, and it's all part of the same big, huge transition and problem that we're going through that's going to continue for a decade or more, I think. It's a long transition. And unfortunately, we're living it, and we all feel it very much right now. So now I'm going to talk about the questions that nobody has an answer for, because these are the questions that come up a lot, such as how many religion beat specialists are there in the country or even in the world? And I tell people that nobody really knows that. The reason being, it's not a very practical thing to survey every media person in the world or in the country, and that doesn't get done. But secondly, we know how many people belong to Religious Communicators Council. We know how many people belong to Religion Newswriters Association. But we don't necessarily have every single person out there who is writing about faith and values, either for a religious organization or for a religious media outlet or for a general circulation media outlet. So we don't really know, and we're very cautious of saying, that this is the number of religion specialists in the world. We know right now that, and our best estimate is that in terms of people writing about religion regularly, in other words, truly specializing in it, in major media outlets, and including, some weekly outlets, some smaller daily metro kinds of papers, we know that number is at least about 400. But we also know that there are many, many people who don't do it full time, and they may write columns, blogs, whatever, and the number is much higher than that. But for certain, most of the religion content produced in this country, most of it is produced by non-specialists, right? And that becomes a big pain in the rear for us. But that's the reality, is that most of the content that's in the media is being created by non-specialists. So the question is the same for how many religious communicators there are in the country or the world. And so Shirley could speak really directly to that, but I imagine she would echo the comments that I have made here, although she could tell you how many members RCC has, and we could also talk about the trends of those numbers if you want in the Q&A. I'm trying to hustle here so we have plenty of time for questions. And then the question about, is religion journalism and religious communication getting better or worse? I really hate that question. And that's why I started off with history. Because, let's see, I went to journalism school. I went to Northwestern, and I was sitting in a classroom with IBM Selectrics. Okay, that's how old I am. Typewriters, we were learning on typewriters with carbon paper. Yes, carbon paper. You gave one copy to your editor, and you kept one. I've seen a lot of trends. I've seen a lot of articles that hype it as, the best time on the religion beat, and articles that hype it as the worst time. So I'm really cautious to say, how a trajectory is going. I do think that, the beat, like other beats, has been horribly affected by the economic challenges of communication. And this goes for religious communicators, where bishops and church bodies have, other religious organizations have failed to understand the importance of having specialists on their staff. And similarly in newsrooms where editors, managers, publishers have seen religion as one of these soft, optional kinds of beats. These trends tend to last for a little while, and then you have a crisis, then you have a political event or some other kind of trend that leads newsrooms to switch courses. We haven't seen that happen so much in many of the faith bodies in terms of their communication staff, but we are seeing new organizations emerge and become more vital and more active. So there's a shift really from communication staff who used to be very strong in the mainline Protestant organizations, for instance, and perhaps some evangelical organizations even declining. But Muslim organizations, Sikh organizations, Buddhist organizations, Hindu organizations, we're seeing some of these groups become much more savvy about their communication skills and having true specialists. So there's a shift going on a little bit here. And then the other thing, obviously, I can't answer is it a viable career option for you? You know, I have 3 children, and my middle daughter is a senior in the School of Journalism here. And when she told me she was going to major in journalism, I thought, oh, you know, but the benefit of being in a school of journalism and seeing the next generation and seeing the new tools that are emerging in the new business strategies is that it's a really exciting time. It's a really exciting time. And it's a vital time for there to be specialists in religion, I think. We're at an all-time low in terms of religious literacy, I think. And religion has increased as a component in the culture in our country and in our world. Finally, last slide. These are kind of the big challenges that are consistent with both religious communicators and religion journalists. And these are kind of big, huge, complex questions, but there's some that we can talk about if you want in the Q&A. And that is, you know, how do you fairly represent the other? How do you write about groups whose beliefs differ from your own? Even if you're a religious communicator, that becomes an issue. Who speaks or who is a religious authority? That's easy in the case of hierarchical groups like the Roman Catholic Church, but you see many issues today regarding the Muslim community or other non-hierarchical groups where that's more difficult. And even within hierarchical institutions, how do you get diversity in those voices and expand the sorts of people who are contributing to the roles and the actions of that entity in the world? As I already mentioned, management generally underestimate the value of clear communication about beliefs. And this one is a huge one. This, how do we get beyond conflict narratives to show the healing and the helping power of belief? I think this has been lost in a lot of ways when religion sections and religious denominational magazines contracted significantly in the 2000s. And there's little place for that to occur now, or at least to occur in a way that attracts significant audiences. So I think that's a huge challenge that we're all facing. And then how do religious communicators and religion journalists build trust and mutual respect for the roles that we play, which are different, but they're both really vital in terms of improving religious literacy in the public. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. Let's see if I can just, there we go. There we go. So I ran through a lot of very complicated things, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Yeah, you all have been very nicely chatting along while Debra's speaking, so I know you're good at practicing the chat function. So go ahead and post those in there. Debra, can you see the chat window again now that you've stopped sharing?
I can see it. I'm going to be looking up at a different monitor, but yes, I can see it. I just have to make it larger because my eyes. Okay.
All right, fire away, folks.
All righty.
Everybody type at once.
And I see Kelsey mentioned that in the Deseret News, but yeah, there are very few. What we have seen in terms of entries into our contest, our section contest, is those entries have dwindled. We used to get, 35 to 40 entries, and there used to be multiple elaborate sections that would be entered. And I think most recently, before we changed Chakern a little bit, it was really, really low. I mean, I want to say under 10. So
what about, to all of you, what are some of the challenges you've experienced so far, either in your early religion reporting and communication careers or in trying to seek careers? Oh, and I see we have a question too from Holly.
Yeah.
So think about that, and then we'll address Holly's question here.
So I was reading Holly's question and not paying attention to what you were saying.
Yeah, no, go ahead and address Holly's question while everybody else mulls over that question I posed. So
okay, so yeah, so Holly wrote, why do you suppose people assume that covering religion equals being religious? Folks don't assume I'm a criminal, a police officer, when I tell them that I write about crime and breaking news. And it is an interesting aspect. Anybody who works in a mainstream outlet knows that if you write a lot about religion, people start coming up to you in the newsroom, and you start finding out where they practice their faith, if they have a faith tradition. It just seems to be, I think it's because in part they view it as a safe space. I find that among students especially. They assume that if I'm, involved with religion and media, that I am supportive of it in some broad way. I think also there is this kind of view that, again, many newsrooms are what some people would describe as secular, or having many people who don't believe in a faith tradition, as we saw from the data. And so I think that they assume that's the anomaly. And I think also it's kind of like, well, it gets to that science religion sort of contradiction, which I don't quite get that, but you're right. I mean, people assume, or at least people are very curious about your own religious tradition when you're a journalist. And I don't know of any research or have a good answer as to that. In terms of Sarah's question, or from Catherine rather, about what are journalism schools doing to improve religious literacy. And there are courses specifically in religious literacy. We've had an online course here at the University of Missouri, since about 2008. I think that, but in terms of, journalism schools, there are a handful. Maybe when I say handful, I want to say maybe about 30 maybe at the 30 to 40 that have specific courses in covering religion or in religion and media. Many of those schools are religious schools, overwhelmingly Christian schools. So there would be a course in religion and media there, which is a little bit different than what you're saying in terms of religious literacy. But, at the largest, some of the largest and most major religion schools in the country, there is a course in religion and media. Cecilia Holmes teaches one down at University of South Carolina. Gus Niebuhr teaches one up at Syracuse. There's one taught at Marquette. There's been one taught off and on at Northwestern, at University of Southern California, at NYU. Anyway, you can, at Columbia, of course. So there are these courses, but there are a lot of places where there isn't such a course. And part of that's because you don't have somebody who's specialized in that topic or who has the kind of knowledge that would make it work, really. I'm just going to go straight down at the questions, and we'll go as long as we can, if that's okay. So Betsy is asking about the seemingly contradictory statements that a journalist's own religion shouldn't affect their ability to cover other religions, but that it would be great to expand the religious demographics of journalists, for example, expanding the number of Muslim journalists. And how do you wrestle with that nuance? I think, that they're two separate things, really. For instance, there has been quite a concerted effort in the last several decades, really, to expand the number of evangelicals in newsrooms. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in those newsrooms to write about religion, right? So I think I see the desire to have diverse newsrooms, and that means ethnically, religiously, culturally, to be, that it's a shared value among newsrooms, and it's been a very difficult value to be able to make some traction at. The numbers of African Americans in newsrooms, of Hispanics in newsrooms, has been virtually unchanged. I think about 13%, I want to say, for decades, despite many, many, many different efforts by, the Association of Newspaper Editors and radio and television news directors, many of these groups, and grant funding. There's been a lot of programmatic effort at trying to diversify newsrooms. And one thing that sometimes gets mentioned, but not a lot, is class even, right? I mean, newsrooms in many places are comprised of elites. So I think that the desire and interest in having diverse newsrooms should include religious diversity. And I think it's important for the public to see journalists who come from many different backgrounds, because I think they bring voices to the table that sometimes are not always heard, and they bring context and richness to the sourcing. Now, I think that's a totally separate issue from who covers religion. I don't think there should be a religious test for who covers religion. I think if you're an atheist and you want to cover religion, no problem. I think if you're, a devout, we have clergy, we have many people who are ordained or have gone to seminary who cover religion. The test for a high caliber religion journalist is your ability to be fair and to be accurate and to be balanced and to include context in ways that further truth and reality. Those are the requirements for being a good journalist, and what your particular faith tradition is shouldn't have an impact unless it's prohibiting you from those values, from practicing those values. Okay, Sean wants to tie a few ideas together. Oh, let's see. When it moves, I get discombobulated here a little bit. Okay, let's see. So What are the connections between the decline in coverage and conflict narratives? Is that shift conforming religion news to standard news communication patterns, or is a conflict narrative frame uniquely easy shorthand for covering religion? I think it's a couple of different things. I think, first of all, as I tried to indicate, you know, we've had conflict narratives have been around for a century and a half. So they're not new when it comes to religion. I do think that today's methods of producing news and today's audiences and today's media outlets make it very difficult for complex topics to be told with context. And when you're doing shorthand and when you're trying to condense complex ideas, it often, very often, unfortunately, kind of narrows down to a conflict frame. You know, and the other aspect to that is that, you know, for all their good thinking, audiences really do actually love conflict, right? They respond to conflict. They click on conflict. And now we can measure that in ways that we never used to measure that before. So, you know, yes, you have a few Upworthies out there, Upworthy like sites out there, but when your you know, site managers are looking at your traffic, the kinds of things, I mean, we you know, we can see this with Donald Trump, right? Regardless of what some people say, they are attracted, you know, to conflict. So I think it's a combination of those things, and it makes it a huge challenge. It's a bigger challenge today for us, I think, than in the past when professionals made decisions about what the public, what their interpretations of what the public wanted and needed. And I'm not saying that those interpretations were always right, but nonetheless, it produced content that there was a serendipity to the content that you could come across stories that you might not have thought of reading or viewing or hearing. And that's gone for the most part today. We're hearing and reading and viewing stories that are shared with us by our friends and like-minded people. I'm not sure I quite, that's a really complex thing, but I hope I kind of drew some of those together. And yay Mizzou, Sarah. Okay. From a communications guy, so there may be a journalism term of art that I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. Let's see. RE, religion and media courses in the university. That's right. There are courses that do touch on religion and media. I mean, there's a whole field of scholarship on religion and media. I mean, there are professional organizations of scholars of religion and media. The challenge is that this term media, in some cases, gets broadened by a lot of scholars to include film, to include rhetoric. So, you know, how, you know, the religious rhetoric that political candidates use, to include, you know, art, literature, you know, fiction, those kinds of things. So when you hear religion and media, it can often mean a very broad thing. Jacob, in terms of what you're talking about, I see that it's very much a, you know, a religion and journalism or religion communication sort of focus. But a lot of times when you see religion and media in a title, it's not. It's a much broader thing approaching the topic from a cultural studies perspective. Let's see. The challenge of representing the other. This is from Melissa Binder, and I know we're running out of time. So for me, the biggest challenge in this area has been the cultural values, expectations, politics, sensitivities associated with an unfamiliar faith, right? As opposed to understanding the core beliefs. And then what advice do you have as we get to know people in communities of different faith backgrounds? And are there specific questions you always ask? You know, there are some general guidelines. And let me just mention, first of all, that there have never been more tools and resources at your fingertips than ever before. Never. I mean, you know, these kinds of tools didn't exist, you know, even in the 1990s. So, you know, between, you know, online style guides and story ideas with links to sources and research, like the kind of work that Pew does, I mean, there is a phenomenal amount of data and information. And when I teach, you know, I've taught journalists in Myanmar about covering religion, and you know, when you realize the dearth of data and information in developing countries when it comes to religion for those journalists. And so, so that we have a lot of tools. There are no shortcuts. That's the challenge. That's one of the huge challenges. There are no shortcuts. It's, you know, always learning something new. And it's always requires a lot of research. You know, these days it's a lot easier to get that research. I think one of the, if I had to say kind of a golden rule, is to make sure that you let the people of a certain faith tell you, you know, speak to you directly. In other words, don't let others, unless they're really a high-level scholar, perhaps, but don't let others be used to describe what somebody else believes. You know, that's really problematic, and I think probably, you know, that's kind of a, you know, one of those 101 kinds of rules, but nonetheless, I mean, it's so important to make sure that you're hearing what people believe from their own mouths. And that's why that gets to that question of religious authority, because that raises, you know, who is the authority to talk on behalf of, you know, American Muslims, for instance. Well, there is no one person, right? So that becomes a challenge, and that's why it's so messy and so complicated in this topic. But I am I'm a data freak. I mean, I love data. I love survey data. I want numbers, you know, and so I think you can't, you always need to start there in terms of looking at values and looking at beliefs and attitudes when it comes to politics and all those kinds of things, because it's so much more nuanced than the average person, and even than some religious experts even understand. So it's really important to get what data is out there. And that's another challenge of the beat, is a lot of data is not public. So thank goodness for Pew. So we're, I think we're pretty much out of time, or maybe, do you want me to take one more question, Tiffany?
About 3 more minutes, and I said there was 2 more questions there. Maybe you could say something briefly about both, and then any others, I invited folks to follow up via email.
Okay. So one question, let's see, what place do those who are in fact religious journalists who report about and are employed by a particular religious body have in the conversation? We understand journalism as a field that is ideally untainted by personal biases and beliefs and should not be a vehicle for the promotion of an ideology or group. So what of journalists or not communicators who may be in PR for a church or religious organization and who are part of an official publication? So so one of the challenges, I think, that we have seen arise over the years, and where I think, you know, at Religion Newswriters, we've tried to open up to religious communicators and people who are doing public relations, not public relations, but who are doing writing and working for religious publication with a particular religious orientation. One of the things, first of all, that unites everybody are the skills, are the basic core values. And the challenge, I think, for religious journalists can be trying to practice professional journalistic values while at the same time working for an organization that doesn't really have or need to have or should have necessarily the public's right to know or First Amendment first and foremost in its in its mindset. And so throughout the years there have been tensions at times between people whose professional values to tell a story a certain way will come into conflict with a religious leader's perspective and interpretation of a way to tell a story. And often I think that has to do more with stories that don't get told. So, as a religious communicator may see the value and benefit of being truthful or open about a problem or concern in a religious body, and religious hierarchy may not see, may have an impulse to keep that story or that perspective out of the public's eye. And then you have the additional challenge of, well, if you keep it out of the public's eye, do you also then keep it out of your constituents' eyes? In other words, people who are practicing that faith and who may be, reading or listening to or hearing, consuming religious media that is produced and created by a religious body. And so that's I think that there are tensions there that are very similar to the kinds of tensions that other kinds of journalists engage in. And again, that's been going on for a very long time. And sometimes it's had very unhappy endings. I think the other question has to do with proselytization versus communication. And that's a whole nother bag that I think we would need another hour for. So I'm gonna leave it at that. And then let's see. And then the question about religion not being a sexy topic. And I think that that is extremely difficult in the broadcast media and always has been. And, as a result, we have never had very many people who specialize in religion in broadcast mainstream media, although there is quite a robust religious media presence still in this country and even globally. I do think it's one of the inherent challenges about faith and values and the time limitations. One person who did this quite a bit is Michelle Biernan. And she was laid off from the Tampa Tribune, but really when they combined their newsroom with a local television station owned by the same company, she was one at the forefront of telling those kinds of local media kinds of stories about religion and telling them to broadcast audiences in the 2000s and up until about 2 years ago. I do think that religious communicators have a lot to offer in this area because many religious communicators are producing content for both broadcast vehicles and also online vehicles. And so I do think this is where, forging a friendship and alliances with the religious communicators can help sometimes because they have had to face that challenge themselves. But there aren't easy answers to a lot of these questions, and they have been around for a long time. But what we hope is that we are all our own cheerleaders in this, and we are all here because we understand the importance of communicating about faith and values. And so I just want to thank you for being here, and thank you again for your commitment and for your interest in what I think is the very best topic in the entire world. So.
Thank you, Deborah, so very much. I hope everybody enjoyed that. As I mentioned, I know we're out of time, over by 4 minutes, but please do email questions, and we will do our best to address them either via email or at future topics. So you all will be hearing from me in the next couple days with the survey and with some other program announcements. So thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic day, and we'll talk to you soon.